Picture a Viking. Go ahead, take a moment. Chances are you're seeing a broad-shouldered warrior in a horned helmet, axes raised, longship crashing through grey northern waves, villages burning on a distant shore. That image is everywhere. Movies, television, video games, company logos. It's so deeply embedded in popular imagination that it feels like historical fact. Except it's barely half the story, and in some ways it's not even that. The real Vikings were something far stranger, far more complicated, and honestly far more interesting than the raiders we've been sold. Yes, they raided, brutally and effectively, but they also traded across thousands of miles of rivers and open ocean. They settled in places no European had ever seen. They negotiated, intermarried, converted, adapted, and occasionally disappeared entirely into the cultures they'd once threatened. The men and women who launched out of Scandinavia in the late 700s left behind a world that's still reshaping ours in ways most people never stop to consider. So the questions worth asking are these. Why did they leave in the first place? What did they actually find when they got there? And what, in the end, went wrong? Because something did go wrong. The Viking Age had a beginning and it had an end. And understanding both means looking past the mythology into something messier and more human. These weren't faceless raiders erupting from nowhere. They came from a specific place at a specific moment when that place was changing in ways that made staying put feel impossible for many and irrelevant for others. Scandinavia wasn't some frozen, isolated world that suddenly exploded outward. It was a society in motion long before the first monastery burned. Climate, population pressure, political transformation, ambition, opportunity, and sheer chance all played roles in what happened next. No single explanation fits, no single theory covers the whole of it, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something simpler than the past deserves. That's what this story is really about. Not just the raids, but the full sweep of a world expanding and eventually contracting in ways that left permanent marks across 3 continents. Before we get into it, though, I want to know where you're listening from right now. What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I check them more than I probably should, and there's something genuinely wonderful about knowing this story is reaching people across so many different corners of the world. Imagine you're standing on a farm somewhere in what we'd now call Western Norway, sometime around the year 750. The word Norway doesn't really mean anything to you yet. The word Viking means even less. What you know is this particular valley, this particular fjord, cutting deep into the mountains behind your house, these particular fields that your grandfather cleared and your father worked, and that you will work after him. The land around you is extraordinary and punishing in equal measure. To your back, mountains that rise so steeply they block sunlight for months at a stretch. To your front, a fjord so deep it could swallow a cathedral. The soil you farm is a narrow strip wedged between rock and water, and it doesn't give up its yield easily. You grow barley, some rye, maybe oats if the season is kind. You keep cattle, sheep, pigs. You fish when the fjord cooperates, which isn't always. Everything about your life is shaped by the simple geographic fact that Scandinavia is enormous in area and miserly with its farmable land. The best estimates suggest that usable agricultural land across the entire Norwegian coast amounts to a thin sliver of the total territory. The rest is mountain, forest, frozen bog, and stone. Denmark is different, flatter, more workable, which is part of why Danish political organisation would develop differently from Norwegian and Swedish. Sweden, stretching east, has more interior forest and lake country with river systems pointing like fingers toward the Baltic. These aren't minor geographic details, they're the skeleton that everything else in Norse society was built on. The fragmented coastline of Norway in particular meant there was no natural political centre, no obvious capital, no easy way for any single ruler to project power over the next valley, let alone the next fjord. Local chieftains held their territories through personal authority, through generosity, and through the credible threat of violence. That was true across most of Scandinavia. Political power was intensely local, intensely personal, and constantly contested. Which brings you to the most important thing in your world, and that's the people you're connected to. Kinship wasn't sentimental in Norse society. It was structural. Your kin were your legal protection, your insurance against bad harvests, your army if someone wronged you and needed to be made right. Honor wasn't an abstract virtue. It was a public accounting that determined your standing in every negotiation you'd ever conduct. An insult left unanswered was a debt that accumulated interest. A gift given demanded a gift returned, not because people were greedy, but because the exchange of gifts was the mechanism through which alliances were formed and maintained. The local chieftain didn't rule by decree. He held people together through feasting, through generosity, through a constant flow of gifts and favours that created webs of obligations stretching across entire regions. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's easy to look at Norse society from the outside and see only the violence, which was real and often extreme. What's harder to see is that the violence operated within an elaborate social logic. The raids that would eventually shock Europe weren't generated by people who had no rules. They were generated by people who had very specific rules, and those rules happened to work differently when you were dealing with strangers outside your kin network than when you were dealing with neighbours inside it. Now, here's where the ships come in, and this is one of those cases where environment produced genius so precisely it almost seems planned. If you live on a landscape that's fundamentally a series of disconnected valleys separated by mountains and connected by water, then water isn't an obstacle. Water is the road. Norse shipbuilders weren't simply skilled craftsmen, though they absolutely were. They were solving a specific engineering problem that their geography posed every single day. How do you move people and goods quickly across a coastline that's impossible to traverse on foot? You build boats that can do things no other boats in the world can do at this moment in history. The clinker-built hulls, with their overlapping planks creating a structure that flexed rather than resisted the sea's movement, were a product of centuries of iteration and refinement. These weren't boats designed for occasional use. They were built by people for whom water was the primary highway of everyday life, and that shows in every technical choice made in their construction. The shallow drafts that could navigate rivers as easily as open ocean, the symmetric bows and sterns that could be beached and reversed without turning around, the lightweight construction that made them fast enough to matter. This technology didn't appear fully formed right before the raids. It developed over generations of ordinary use, fishermen, coastal traders, people moving between islands and fjords and markets. When the Viking Age arrived, the ships were already there because the need for them had always been there, and so had the trade. This is the part that most popular accounts skip over almost entirely. Before the first monastery was raided, Scandinavian merchants were already moving through networks that reached from the Baltic deep into what is now Germany, Russia, and the British Isles. There were trading centres, places like Ribe in Denmark and Hedeby, which served as exchange points where Scandinavian furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves moved against Frankish silver, English cloth, and goods coming north from the Mediterranean world. Norse traders knew the coastlines, they knew the rivers, they knew which markets paid best for which goods, and they had been navigating all of it long before raiding became a notable occupation. So when you hear the Viking expansion described as an explosion of savage aggression from an isolated, primitive people, something important is missing from that description. These were not people emerging from darkness into a world they didn't understand. They already had maps in their heads, built from generations of trading contact. They already had political relationships with certain Frankish and English powers. They already knew where the wealth was. What changed wasn't their knowledge of the outside world. What changed was something inside Scandinavia itself, something that made the existing knowledge suddenly urgently useful in a new way. The society that produced the Vikings was already in motion, already connected, already technically sophisticated in ways that the raid-focused narrative tends to flatten into simple ferocity. The farms were real, the families were real, the honour obligations and the gift networks and the local chieftains and the carefully maintained boats were all real, and they were all, in ways that would take another generation to become fully visible, building pressure towards something that couldn't stay contained in a narrow strip of land between mountains and sea. What exactly created that pressure is a story worth telling carefully, and it starts with something as unglamorous as farmland. So go back to that farm in the fjord. Your father is still alive. Your grandfather may be just gone. The boundaries of your world are marked by stone walls and grazing rights, and the memory of who cleared which patch of forest. There is no free, empty land lying around waiting for energetic young men to claim it. Every usable field has a story attached to it, and that story ends with someone's name. You're the second son, or maybe the third. You work as hard as your older brother. You swing the same axe, take the same risks at sea, show up at the same assemblies. But everyone knows how inheritance works. When your father dies, the main farm goes to the heir. You might get a slice, a corner plot, or maybe not even that. Just a share of the movable wealth, some livestock, a sword if you're lucky. Enough to live, not enough to thrive, and certainly not enough to host the kinds of feasts that make people say your name with respect. Historians used to talk about this as if it were the whole explanation: population pressure. Too many mouths, not enough land, therefore the Vikings sail out. There is probably some truth in that, especially in places like Western Norway, where arable land really is a razor-thin margin between rock and water. Archaeology suggests that by the 8th century, many of the best farm sites were long occupied, and marginal areas, steeper slopes, poorer soils, were being brought under cultivation. That looks a lot like a society pushing up against environmental limits. But it's not the full story, and most scholars today are wary of treating it like a simple equation. If population pressure alone automatically produced Viking-style expansion, you'd expect similar raiding cultures to erupt in every crowded coastal region on Earth. That didn't happen. So land scarcity is better understood as one piece of a larger bundle of pressures and opportunities. Another piece is what was happening at the very top of society. Imagine being not just a landless younger son, but an ambitious local chieftain in a world where political power is starting to change. In parts of Scandinavia, especially Denmark, you can see the outlines of something like early state formation. Bigger halls, more centralized control over trade. The beginnings of royal authority that claims to stand above local chiefs, not just beside them. In that world, competition among elites becomes sharper. It's not enough to be the strongest man in your valley. Now there are men a few fjords over or across the strait who are building bigger ships, attracting more followers, minting or hoarding more silver. The logic of honor and gift-giving you grew up with suddenly demands more and more spectacular gifts if you want to keep your network loyal. Cattle and homespun cloth will only stretch so far. Silver, foreign weapons, exotic luxury goods. Those make people talk. One interpretation sees early Viking raids as an extension of this internal arms race. Raiding becomes a way for up-and-coming leaders to leapfrog their rivals. Lead a successful expedition to a wealthy monastery, come home with chests of liturgical silver and gold, and you can instantly stage the kind of feasts that bind men to you for life. In that sense, sailing west isn't a break from Norse politics. It's a continuation of them by other means. Of course, this only works because the outside world presented very specific vulnerabilities. The first recorded raid on Lindisfarne in 793 didn't happen in a vacuum. Scandinavian traders had already been moving along these coasts for generations. They knew there were monasteries and churches inland from easily accessible beaches. They knew those sites housed concentrated wealth. Chalices, reliquaries, altar plates, often poorly defended, sometimes not defended at all. Christian rules about not bearing arms in holy spaces made them spiritually formidable, but militarily weak. So when we ask why the Vikings left Scandinavia, we also have to ask why certain parts of Europe were such inviting targets right then. The answer seems to involve a convergence. On one side, mobile maritime communities with excellent ships, flexible social structures, and leaders hungry for prestige. On the other, fragmented kingdoms, wealthy religious institutions, and coastlines not yet organized for systematic defense. Layered over all of this is trade. The 8th and 9th centuries saw growing flows of silver into northern Europe, much of it originally from the Islamic world. Arabic dirhams show up in astonishing quantities in Scandinavian hoards, tens of thousands of coins buried in fields and bogs. Those coins didn't fall from the sky. They came through trade networks that linked the Baltic to the Volga and beyond, and through the selling of furs, walrus ivory, and people. Slaves. Here the lines between raiding, migration, and commerce blur almost completely. A ship might leave a fjord with cargo to sell, stop at a trading emporium like Hedeby, then continue on to raid a poorly defended coastal site, then swing by another port to sell both legitimate goods and captives taken in the attack. The same vessel might, in a different season, carry families and livestock to settle in a new land. To the people involved, these weren't sharply distinct careers. They were different strategies within a single, fluid maritime economy. Some historians emphasize this economic angle, the expansion of markets, the demand for northern raw materials and human captives, the profitable arbitrage between different regions' tastes for luxury goods. Others focus more on cultural factors, values of honor and fame that made dangerous journeys attractive to young men seeking status, or on religious change within Scandinavia that later complicated relationships with Christian neighbors. No single explanation completely dominates. Instead, you see overlapping motives pushing in the same outward direction. Limited land for younger sons, intensifying competition among chiefs and proto-kings, technological mastery of ships and navigation, knowledge of weak, wealthy targets, expanding trade routes that made both legal and illegal violence profitable, and an underlying social logic in which success abroad could be converted into power at home. When those forces add together, the question almost flips. It becomes less, why did some Scandinavians leave? And more, how could they not? The tools were there. The pressures were building. The sea was already their road. All that remained was to push that road a little farther than their grandfathers had, and to see what happened when they did. When the first longships appear on your horizon, they don't look like history changing. They look like a handful of sleek, low hulls, dark against the morning light, sliding toward a shore that has never really needed to be defended. Put yourself on Lindisfarne in June of 793. You're a monk or a lay brother, or maybe a local farmer bringing grain to the monastery. Your world is organized round rhythms of prayer and tide. The island feels safe, not because it's fortified, but because it's holy. The bones of saints rest here. Kings have given land and treasure to this place, precisely because it is believed to be under divine protection. You hear shouting from the beach. The ships come in fast, riding shallow, needing barely any depth to reach land. Men jump into the water, weapons in hand. They move with the unhurried coordination of people who have done this before. You notice their hair, maybe the unfamiliar cut of their clothes, the strange designs on their shields. You don't know their language, but you understand the intent immediately. There are no walls worth the name, no garrison. The nearest royal army is days away, and even if someone rides for help right now, it wouldn't matter. The monastery's wealth is gathered into a handful of buildings: the church, the treasury, the scriptorium, gold and silver vessels, jewelled reliquaries, books that have taken lifetimes to copy. To you, they are sacred objects, incarnations of the holy. To the raiders, they are portable, meltable wealth. The attack is fast, chaotic, brutal. Some people are killed, others taken away in ropes, shoved onto ships as captives. The raiders don't bother trying to hold territory. They grab what they can carry, metal, cloth, people, and leave before any organised resistance appears. Hours, maybe, from first sighting to empty horizon. What makes Lindisfarne such a shock isn't that violence happened. Violence is a normal feature of 8th century Europe. Kings feud, bandits prey on travellers, borderlands burn. But this feels different for several reasons. First, the target. Monasteries occupy a paradoxical place. They are poor in some ways, vows of poverty, rough clothing, simple food, but rich in others. Centuries of royal and aristocratic donations have concentrated treasure into these religious centres. They are banks of piety, and also, very literally, banks of silver and gold. They sit on rivers and coasts because water is the best highway. That makes them wonderfully connected for pilgrims and trade and painfully exposed to anyone arriving by sea. Second, the psychology. Christian chroniclers see this not just as an attack on property, but as an assault on God's own house. One famous text describing the Lindisfarne raid laments heathen men desecrating holy places, slaughtering monks at the altar, defiling relics. Whether the details are strictly accurate or somewhat exaggerated, the rhetoric is unmistakable. This is framed as a cosmic insult, a sign of divine anger, an omen of the end times. Those chroniclers are our main written sources for the earliest Viking raids in the West. They don't sit down to produce neutral reports. They write sermons in narrative form, full of shock, moral interpretation, and fear. They emphasize the strangeness of the attackers, their suddenness, their cruelty. Over time, you can see a stereotype harden on the page. The Viking as the perfect outsider, pagan, seaborn, unpredictable, dripping with stolen gold and Christian blood. That image sticks. It's part of why, centuries later, we still reflexively imagine horned helmets and burning churches, even though actual helmets with horns are almost entirely a modern fantasy, and most Viking interactions with Europe are more complicated than pure destruction. Early on, though, from the Christian point of view, it really does feel like a new kind of threat. Raids hit Lindisfarne, then other monasteries and coastal sites, Jarrow, Iona, small churches, and larger trading ports. The pattern is consistent: quick in, quick out, profit measured in plunder and captives, not acres of land. These are hit-and-run operations designed for maximum gain and minimum entanglement. But that pattern doesn't stay static. As the 9th century unfolds, something shifts. Some raiding groups start to overwinter instead of sailing home each autumn. They build temporary camps in river estuaries and on islands, turning them into seasonal bases. From there, they can strike far inland, along the great watery arteries of Europe, up the Seine toward Paris, up the Loire, up the Thames, and its tributaries. With overwintering comes larger forces. Instead of a dozen ships hitting a single monastery, you start to hear about fleets of dozens, even hundreds of vessels coordinating major campaigns. They lay siege to cities. They demand tribute, danegeld, from kings who find it cheaper to pay off the raiders than to fight them year after year. Some leaders sign treaties, grant land in exchange for service, use Viking groups as allies against rival kings. In other words, European rulers adapt. They start building fortified bridges to block river routes. They strengthen coastal defences, reorganise local militias, experiment with faster mustering of troops. In places like Anglo-Saxon England and Frankish Francia, you can trace military reforms, burr systems, mounted response forces that owe a lot to the pressure of Viking attacks. Diplomacy becomes part of the toolkit. Some Scandinavian leaders are baptised, married into local dynasties, given official titles. Others accept regular payments, turning what began as piracy into something closer to tax protection. The line between raider and mercenary blurs. And through all of this, it's important not to imagine the Vikings as a single, coordinated super-enemy. The men who burn a monastery on the Irish coast are not necessarily taking orders from the king who later sits in Dublin. The crew that carries off captives from a French village may have nothing to do with the band establishing a farmstead in northern England. What we call Vikings encompasses traders, pirates, farmers, exiles, ambitious war leaders, and their followers, all operating in small shifting alliances. Some come once, get what they can, and never return. Others pivot from raiding to settlement, from plunder to taxation and rule. A few carve out lasting polities. Many vanish from the record the moment their ships disappear over the horizon. For the people whose churches burn, that nuance hardly matters. The first shock in Europe feels like a storm appearing out of a clear sky. Strange ships, strange gods, strange violence. But behind that shock, there is a pattern taking shape. These early raids are probes, experiments, rough drafts of a new relationship between Scandinavia and the wider European world. And the next phase of that relationship unfolds on a set of islands just across the North Sea, where the raiders don't just come to steal, they come to stay, When they first start coming in larger numbers, England, Ireland, and Scotland are not countries in the modern sense. They're mosaics of kingdoms, petty lordships, monasteries, and tribal territories, stitched together by personal loyalties and oaths that can unravel fast under pressure. From a Scandinavian point of view, what lies across the North Sea is an opportunity map. Look at the rivers of England, the Humber, the Trent, the Thames, the Ouse. They're like fingers reaching into the interior, and for people whose superpower is shallow draft ships, that looks like an invitation. The coasts are dotted with monasteries and trading ports. Inland are fertile plains, relatively dense populations, and rulers who are often more concerned with each other than with threats from the sea. At first, the pattern holds: hit, run, disappear. Then, in 865, something different arrives on English shores. Later chroniclers call it the Great Heathen Army. Army might suggest uniforms and a central command, but it's more likely a coalition. Bands from Denmark, Norway, maybe southern Sweden, drawn by rumours of easy wealth and increasingly by stories of land. They do not behave like the raiding parties of a generation before. Instead of burning a monastery and sailing off, they move inland. They overwinter in East Anglia. They demand horses, not just coin. Mounted now, they roll from kingdom to kingdom: Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia. They're not just stealing. They're negotiating, extorting, installing puppet kings, accepting tribute, and sometimes toppling dynasties outright. If you live in one of those kingdoms, it feels less like a raid and more like an invasion. By the 870s, a rough frontier emerges in England between territory under Scandinavian control or heavy influence, and lands still ruled by Anglo-Saxon kings, especially in Wessex. Later generations call this frontier the Danelaw. Danelaw doesn't mean every inhabitant is Danish. It's more about legal and cultural gravity. On one side, Anglo-Saxon law codes and traditions dominate. On the other, Norse practices, customs, and expectations shape how disputes are resolved, land is held, and oaths are sworn. Over time, the line between them blurs. You can see the blending in place names, towns ending in by Thorpe, Thwaite, Toftmark areas of heavy Scandinavian settlement. You can see it in language. Old Norse words filter into Old English: sky, law, window, husband, knife. In frontier markets and mixed villages, a Norse speaker and an English speaker can often understand each other well enough to trade, marry, argue. In theory, this is enemy occupation. In practice, it's patchwork. Some local elites cut deals with the newcomers, keeping their land in exchange for loyalty or payments. Some Scandinavian leaders marry into Anglo-Saxon families, becoming, within a generation, just another flavour of local nobility. Law codes are negotiated, not imposed from a distant capital. When later kings of England issue charters in these regions, they sometimes mention the law of the Danes and the law of the English side by side. Across the Irish Sea, something parallel and yet distinct is happening. Ireland at this point is a dense web of small kingdoms and church sites, loosely coordinated but fiercely competitive. Early Viking visits there look familiar. Monasteries like Armagh and Clonmacnois suffer the same fate as Lindisfarne. But very quickly, Scandinavian groups start founding longfort, fortified ship camps on river mouths and sheltered bays. Some of those longfort grow up. Dublin begins as one of these bases in the 9th century and develops into a full-fledged town. To a Viking leader, it is a prize beyond gold. It sits on a river with easy access inland, and on the sea route that links Norway, the Scottish Isles, the English coast, and eventually Iceland. Within a few generations, Dublin is a major hub of trade and slave dealing, connecting Irish captives, English coin, and even goods from as far as the Islamic world. Norwegian and Danish leaders in Ireland do not simply sit outside the existing system. They become part of it. They ally with some Irish kings against others. They fight, intermarry, convert, and occasionally get killed in the same messy dynastic politics that have already been raging for centuries. A Norse king of Dublin might have an Irish mother, Christian priests at his court, and trade ties with both York and the Hebrides. Scotland, especially the islands and northern coasts, becomes another Scandinavian world. The Orkneys, Shetlands, Hebrides, and parts of mainland Scotland see heavy settlement. Here, Vikings are not just raiders, they become landlords and earls. Norse place names blanket the coastline. In some areas, Gaelic and Norse cultures fuse into something hybrid, visible centuries later in folklore, personal names, even boat designs. Through all of this, conflict never really disappears. In England, the most famous opponent of Scandinavian expansion is Alfred of Wessex, later called the Great. Facing the great heathen army, he loses battles, flees into the marshes, regroups. Then he experiments with new strategies, fortified berths, a reformed army system, fleets designed to counter Viking ships. Some campaigns end in defeat for one side, some in treaties that partition land or demand conversions and hostages. The balance between conquest and coexistence is constantly in flux. Some treaties hold for decades, others collapse within a season. A Scandinavian war leader might spend 1 year taking Danegeld from an English king, the next year fighting as that same king's ally against a rival. A monastery that was burned once might, a generation later, hold land from a Scandinavian patron. For the Vikings who come, the British Isles offer several kinds of reward. There is silver, both in treasure taken and in the form of regular tribute. There is land, farms in eastern England, estates in northern Scotland, plots around Irish towns. There are slaves, captives from raids or warfare, traded through ports like Dublin to markets all over the North Atlantic and beyond. There are strategic bases, harbours and river mouths that anchor long-distance trade and future expeditions. And there are alliances, marriages, oaths, godparent ties that turn yesterday's raider into tomorrow's in-law. From the perspective of the people already living there, this is invasion, disruption, sometimes catastrophe. From the perspective of a chieftain back in Norway or Denmark, it can look like something else, a solution to overcrowded farms, a path to wealth and status, an opening into a wider, richer world. And once those openings exist in the West, the same logic starts pulling ships in other directions, up the rivers that cut into the Slavic lands and down toward the glittering cities of the south. Imagine standing on a low, forested coast, not in the stormy North Atlantic, but on the edge of the Baltic. The water is calmer here, broken up by islands, inlets and skerries. The ships are familiar, long, shallow-keeled, built to ride up onto beaches. But the horizons are different. Instead of the open ocean, there are mouths of rivers, the Daugava, the Neva, the Volkhov. To people raised on fjords and coastal sounds, these are not barriers. They are invitations. If the North Sea is a highway to England and Ireland, the Baltic is a doorway into an entirely different world. Scandinavian traders and war bands begin moving along these coasts in the 8th and 9th centuries, mingling with Finnic and Slavic peoples who already sail and portage here. Later chronicles call the northern newcomers Varangians, sometimes Russ. The terms are slippery, probably referring at first to groups of seaborne Scandinavians, then more broadly to the mixed communities that form around them. Follow one of these groups upriver. You start at a small coastal base on the Baltic, then push inland. The ship glides along dark, slow-moving water between endless walls of forest. At certain points, the river shallows out or breaks into rapids. Here, the real work begins. Cargo is unloaded. The hull is dragged overland on logs or carried by sheer human strength to the next navigable stretch. This is portage, brutal, repetitive, and absolutely essential. These routes stitch together northern Europe like veins, from the Gulf of Finland to Lake Ladoga, from Ladoga up the Volkhov to the fortified site of Staraya Ladoga, and beyond it to Novgorod. From there, by rivers and portages, you can work your way into the Dnieper Basin and all the way down to the Black Sea. Or you can swing southeast into the Volga system and eventually emerge near the Caspian. At the end of those rivers are two of the richest worlds on earth, Byzantium and the Islamic caliphates. To a young leader from Sweden or coastal Finland, the stories sound like fantasy. Cities where the roofs shine with golden tiles, markets where silk, spices and steel weapons are stacked higher than your head. Coinage not in hacked-up bits of silver, but in regular, beautiful discs, stamped with scripts you cannot read. And the most important part, these worlds want what you have. They want furs from the deep northern forests. They want wax and honey, timber and iron, slaves taken in raids or sold by local elites. They also want muscle, warriors who will fight for pay. So the rivers become trade routes as much as raiding corridors. A ship that carries armed men south might come back loaded with silver dirhams from the Abbasid world, Byzantine silks and wine, finely worked weapons, glass beads and icons. Archaeologists in Sweden and the Baltic have found hoards where thousands of Islamic silver coins ended up buried in Scandinavian soil. Someone carried them there, coin by coin, year by year. This traffic does more than make a few chiefs rich. Along the river routes, fortified settlements grow where none existed before, or expand from modest local centres into major nodes. Names like Ladoga, Novgorod, Kiev, Gnezdovo show up in both archaeology and later chronicles as places where Scandinavian, Slavic, Finnic, and other groups meet, trade, intermarry, and sometimes fight. Here we hit one of the most debated parts of early medieval history. Later, in the 12th century, a chronicler writing in Kiev tells a story that has become famous. Local Slavic and Finnic groups, tired of internal conflict, invite a Varangian ruler, Rurik, and his followers to come rule over us. In this telling, Scandinavian leaders provide the initial framework for what becomes the res politis. Some modern scholars see a real core in that story, incoming Norse warband leaders and their retinues becoming a ruling elite over a largely Slavic-speaking population, then gradually assimilating. Others emphasize the deep local roots of power in these regions and argue that Scandinavian figures were just one ingredient among many, important in trade and warfare, but not the sole architects of state formation. The evidence is mixed. We have Scandinavian-style graves and artifacts, place names, personal names with Norse roots, and foreign reports that describe Russ traders who look and behave like Vikings. At the same time, the language that dominates later is Slavic. The majority of everyday material culture looks local, and political institutions seem to be the product of a long, regional evolution rather than an instant import. What seems reasonably clear is this: Scandinavians moving east are not just raiders. They are traders, diplomats, caravan leaders, and mercenaries. Some serve as bodyguards in Slavic courts. Others travel all the way to Constantinople, where they enter imperial service. The Byzantine emperors, wary of their own troops, find northern warriors useful precisely because they have no local power base. Out of this arrangement grows what later sources call the Varangian Guard, an elite corps of axe-wielding foreigners sworn to protect the emperor. Imagine the culture shock. A boy born on a small farm near Uppsala might, within a decade, be standing in the great palace of Constantinople, staring up at mosaics of Christ and the emperor, being paid in gold solidi for his service. He carries stories home of vast stone walls, of processions and relics, of church rituals utterly unlike the sacrifices to Odin and Thor he grew up with. The payoff in status is enormous. Returning with Byzantine silk or Islamic silver marks, you as someone who has seen the wider world. You can distribute exotic goods at feasts, reward followers, and fund shipbuilding. You can wear foreign weapons, commission Christian pendants, or sponsor the carving of rune stones boasting of journeys to the east and service in Greece, meaning Byzantium. Step back for a moment and the pattern starts to look familiar. The same people who sail west to attack monasteries are, in the east, just as likely to be standing guard in a palace, bargaining in markets, or brokering truces between Slavic princes. Raiding is still part of the picture, especially along vulnerable river towns, but it is woven into a larger fabric of commerce, tribute, and hired swords. As the Viking Age unfolds, the horizons of Scandinavians are no longer bounded by their own fjords or by the North Sea. Their mental maps stretch from Iceland in the far Atlantic to Baghdad and Constantinople in the south and east. And once you have that kind of reach, once your cousins are farming in England, your brother is trading on the Dnieper, and your uncle is guarding an emperor, it becomes harder to see Scandinavia as the centre of the world. It starts to look like one province in a much larger system. That shift in perspective will shape the next phase of expansion too. The push into places with no kings, no glittering cities, and almost no people at all. The empty-seeming lands of the North Atlantic. Follow that mental map northwest now, out past the familiar coasts of Norway, into harsher water. The stories say there are islands out there, places where monks once lived in silence, where driftwood piles on black sand beaches, where the summer sun barely sets. At first they're rumours told at winter feasts, half-mythical stepping stones in the cold. Then the ships start going. In the 9th century, crews from Norway and the Norse colonies in the British Isles begin to use a large fog-wrapped island as a way station. Landmarks are vague. A certain shape of mountain, birds wheeling in a particular pattern, the smell of land on the wind. Eventually, people stay. They call it Island, Iceland. For some, it's a refuge. Norwegian chieftains who lose political quarrels at home or bristle under a new king's attempts to centralise power hear that across the sea there's land with no overlord. You take the risk, you get a valley, a river, grazing. No one above you, at least not yet. But Iceland is not empty. There are patches of birch woodland, rich pasture, rivers thick with fish, but the soil is thin and the climate unforgiving. Settling here is an experiment in how far a Norse farming culture can stretch. With no native aristocracy to plug into, the migrants build their own order. Instead of a single king, they create a patchwork of local chieftains and a shared law assembly, the Althing. Once a year, people ride from every district to recite law from memory, settle disputes, arrange marriages, trade, and gossip. There are blood feuds and power plays, but also a sense that the community itself is the final court of appeal. It's a frontier society trying to govern itself without a crown. From Iceland, the horizon pushes farther still. Head west again. Another, even more marginal land comes into view. The sagas say a man named Eric the Red, exiled for killings in Norway and then Iceland, sails until he finds a vast coast of rock and ice, with green fjords tucked like secret pockets along its edge. He calls it Greenland. Was that marketing? Probably. But it worked. Within a generation, shiploads of settlers follow, mostly from Iceland. Archaeology confirms what the sagas suggest in outline. By around the year 1000, two main Norse settlements exist on Greenland's southwestern coast, the eastern and western settlements, together perhaps a few thousand people at their height. Why risk it? Because Greenland offers things Iceland cannot. In the short Arctic summers, there is pasture for sheep, goats, and cattle. There are seals, caribou, and birds. Most tempting of all, there are walrus in the far hunting grounds to the north. To a medieval European elite, walrus ivory is prestige material, used for church reliquaries, knife handles, luxury objects. For a small, isolated community, controlling that supply is a lifeline. For a while, Greenland's farmers and hunters can ship ivory, hides, and maybe even polar bear skins east, and in return receive iron, timber, and luxuries. But the margin for error is razor thin. The Norse carve out fragile farmland in a subarctic climate. They build stone churches and farmsteads that look, in miniature, like those back in Norway. They graze cattle in meadows that are one bad winter away from disaster. When the sea ice is favourable and trade ships arrive, Greenland feels connected, even prosperous. When the ships stop coming because of storms, political turmoil abroad, or later climate cooling, the settlers are dangerously alone. From this already precarious edge, the stories go farther still. The Icelandic sagas, written down a couple of centuries after the events they describe, tell of voyages beyond Greenland to lands they call Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. Stony flatlands, forested coasts, and a place with wild grapes, or at least something grape-like. In these stories, explorers like Bjarni Herjolfsson, Leif Erikson, and others sight and land on coasts that sound very much like parts of Atlantic Canada and perhaps New England. For a long time, these were just tales on parchment. Then, in the 1960s, archaeologists uncovered a Norse site at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland. Turf-walled buildings, ironworking, artefacts recognisably Norse. This isn't a full-blown colony, it looks more like a seasonal base camp. But it anchors at least part of the saga narrative in physical reality. Some North Atlantic Norse really did reach North America around the year 1000. Beyond that, the details blur. The sagas describe rich resources, timber in abundance, good land, game, and also encounters with people they call Skraelings, almost certainly indigenous groups. There are peaceful exchanges, then conflict and bloodshed. In one account, a bull stampedes and startles the locals, leading to a violent clash. In another, a trader and a Skraeling argue over weapons. It's hard to know how much is memory and how much is later storytelling, but almost no scholars doubt that contact of some kind occurred. What we don't see is a lasting Norse Vinland. No permanent stone churches, no continuous farmsteads that survive in the record. Instead, we see evidence for brief occupation and then retreat. The forests and game are tempting, but the Atlantic crossing is long, supply lines stretch thin, and relations with local peoples are unpredictable. For Greenlanders already surviving at the edge, maintaining a far-off outpost on an even richer shore may simply not be worth the risk. And this is where a crucial distinction emerges. To plant a banner on a new coast, to overwinter there, even to build houses and forge iron, that's discovery and first settlement. To turn that foothold into a community that endures for centuries requires something else. Stable climate, reliable connections to other Norse worlds, and relationships with neighbours that don't turn every trading trip into a potential war. Across Iceland, Greenland and Vinland, you can watch the Vikings testing the limits of their system. Sometimes, as in Iceland, the experiment holds and a new society takes root. Sometimes, as in Greenland, it clings on for centuries but stays vulnerable. And sometimes, like Vinland, it flickers briefly and vanishes, leaving only scattered ruins and stories about a rich land just beyond the horizon. Run your mental map back the other direction now from that fragile Greenland farm across the North Atlantic into the older Norse heartlands. By the year 1000, something subtle but enormous is happening. The people who launched those first terrifying summer raids are still around. Their ships still sail. Their axes still gleam. But the worlds they move through have changed, and so do they. Start in England. A few generations after Lindisfarne, Norse warbands aren't just burning monasteries and leaving. They're wintering over, demanding tribute, marrying local women, farming confiscated land. In the old Danelaw zone, you get settlements where a village might have an English name, a Norse legal custom, and people with mixed ancestry calling themselves simply locals. Over time, those blurred edges harden into new identities. Anglo-Scandinavian craftsmen leave behind brooches shaped in Norse styles, with Christian crosses worked into them. Place names combine Old Norse and Old English elements. The sharp line between Viking and English dissolves into a gradient. Normandy shows the same pattern, but accelerated. In 911, a Frankish king grants a Norse leader, Rollo, lands on the Lower Seine. It's a deal. You stop raiding upriver, you defend the coast, you accept baptism. Within a century, Rollo's descendants speak French, swear loyalty to the Frankish crown, and build stone churches. They still remember a Scandinavian ancestor, but they're now Normans, Northmen turned Christian dukes. They don't stop being dangerous, they just change targets and tactics. Instead of hit-and-run raids, they wage organised wars of conquest. England in 1066, Sicily, parts of the eastern Mediterranean, the same maritime skill and appetite for opportunity, now wrapped in the language and institutions of Latin Christendom. Religion sits at the centre of this transformation. Early on, Scandinavians treat Christianity as one more powerful cult in a crowded spiritual landscape. You can pray to Christ and still make an offering to Thor. But Christian kings elsewhere insist on clearer lines. Baptism becomes a diplomatic tool. If you want treaties, dynastic marriages, the legitimacy that comes from being a proper king in European eyes, you embrace the new faith. Harald Bluetooth in Denmark famously boasts that he made the Danes Christian. Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson in Norway push conversion with missionaries, laws, sometimes outright violence. In Iceland, the Althing decides, under political and economic pressure, that the island will officially accept Christianity while quietly allowing some old practices to linger at first. Conversion doesn't erase Norse culture overnight. It does, however, plug Scandinavia into a broader network. Christian kings can write letters to other rulers, send and receive churchmen, participate in pan-European politics. Killing a rival at a feast stops being just a bold move. It starts to look like a sin that endangers your soul and destabilizes your kingdom. That brings us to power. In the early Viking Age, Scandinavia is a patchwork of petty kings and war leaders. Violence is personal, feuds are common, and if you don't like your overlord, you can gather followers and sail away. Over the 10th and 11th centuries, that loosens. Rulers like Harald Bluetooth in Denmark, Olaf Haraldsson, and later kings in Norway, and consolidation in Sweden, slowly knit their realms together. Coinage appears with royal names. Fortresses are built to control key routes. Law codes are written and enforced in the king's name. With stronger crowns come new calculations. If you're a would-be raider, you now have superiors who expect taxes and service, who might forbid you from attacking certain Christian neighbours, who can punish you if your private adventure threatens royal diplomacy. The same ships that once went out on the Viking now sail under royal banners as part of recognised warfare, or they carry cargo. Because as violence becomes more regulated, trade gets more structured. The great emporia, Birka, Hedeby, Kaupang, were already buzzing with activity during the early raids. But over time, more of the wealth moving through them comes from agreed-upon exchange rather than loot. You see standardized weights and measures, merchants attached to royal courts, tolls collected at bridges and harbours. A chieftain who once gained prestige by leading a successful plundering expedition can now gain it by controlling a market town, taxing traffic, and sponsoring churches. Silver still matters, but now stamped coins from England or Germany flow into Scandinavia through trade, tribute, and salaried service as mercenaries rather than purely as stolen hoards. On the fringes, hybrid societies emerge. In Dublin and other Irish coastal towns, Norse elites intermarry with Gaelic families. They adopt elements of Irish law and art while maintaining Scandinavian ship networks. The result is Hiberno-Norse culture. Kings of Dublin with Norse names minting coins with Christian imagery, ruling over mixed populations. In the east, Norse who travelled the Russian rivers to Byzantium and the Caliphate long ago started calling themselves Rus. Their descendants eventually rule Slavic subjects, convert to Eastern Christianity, and become part of the story that leads to medieval principalities like Kiev and Novgorod. Again, the raiders don't vanish. They merge and morph. So when does the Viking Age end? Historians sometimes pick dates. The defeat of a Norwegian king at Stamford Bridge in 1066, the formal Christianization of certain regions, the last major raids on England or the Frankish coast. Those moments matter, but they're markers in a gradual shift rather than a cliff edge. The people we call Vikings don't suddenly disappear. Their grandchildren are still sailing, still fighting, still trading, but they inhabit a different institutional world. Kings are stronger, church networks reach into fjords and valleys. Writing fixes laws instead of relying solely on memory. Raiding for personal gain becomes less socially acceptable, more legally risky, less necessary when there are other paths to power. The end of the Viking Age is not a people going extinct. It is a behaviour losing its niche. As the balance tips towards centralised monarchies, Christian identities and regulated commerce, the freewheeling, semi-independent raiding expedition, the thing that made going Viking distinctive, has less room to operate. Which sets up the final twist in this story. If the Vikings didn't vanish, why did some of their boldest experiments, like Greenland, fail so completely? To answer that, you have to look at what went wrong when their expanding world finally hit hard limits. So what exactly went wrong? Not one single thing. More like a series of doors that quietly swung shut, one after another, until there was no corridor left for the old Viking way to walk down. Start in Western Europe. The early raiders had a simple advantage. They were hitting rich targets that were politically fragmented and militarily unprepared. Monasteries without walls, rivers without patrols, kings who could barely control the land they nominally ruled. By the late 10th and 11th centuries, that's changed. England unifies under stronger kings who can raise fleets and armies quickly. The Frankish lands solidify into realms with fortified towns, stone bridges, and watchful lords. River mouths get chains and towers, coasts get garrisons. Surprise and mobility still matter, but now they're meeting standing defences instead of sleepy monks. At the same time, the home base is changing. As Scandinavian kings consolidate power, those loosely organised warbands lose their wiggle room. You can no longer just grab some ships and go raiding for yourself without considering the king's treaties, the church's displeasure, or the taxes you owe. Some leaders adapt, turning themselves into royal officers or merchants. Others find their style of independent plunder suddenly illegal, immoral, or simply unprofitable. On the far edges, the vulnerabilities are even sharper. Greenland depends on a thin thread of ships from Iceland and Norway. When the climate cools during the Little Ice Age, growing seasons shorten, sea ice thickens, storms become less predictable. At the same time, European tastes and trade routes shift. Walrus ivory, once a luxury commodity that justified long, dangerous voyages, loses value as elephant ivory and other sources become more accessible. For a frontier community already perched on the margin, that's catastrophic. Less trade means fewer ships. Fewer ships mean more isolation. Miss a couple of sailing seasons and a bad harvest or an outbreak of disease has no outside cushion. The colonies' own strategies, insisting on European-style farming, clinging to familiar hierarchies, not fully adopting Inuit techniques, may have made them less flexible precisely when flexibility was needed. Meanwhile, in the core regions, conflict and assimilation do their quiet work. Norse elites in England become English nobles. In Normandy, they turn into French-speaking dukes. In the east, Rus princes align with Slavic majorities and Byzantine Christianity. Old gods are replaced by saints, feasting halls by stone churches, honour won by raiding, by honour won in courts, crusades, and bureaucracies. The Viking world doesn't collapse in a single dramatic defeat. It dissolves as the conditions that birthed it: weak neighbours, political fragmentation at home, high profits from portable loot, and exotic furs and ivory, a climate that favoured northern farming and sailing, gradually erode. What failed was not a people, but a strategy. Once stronger states, changing markets, shifting climate, and new religious and economic systems rewrote the rules. Going Viking stopped being the clever move. The experiment had run its course, leaving behind something more enduring than any raid, the societies that grew out of it. So where does that leave us at the end of this story? With a world that looks very different than the one the first raiders pushed off into. The Vikings didn't just take, they re-stitched the map. Their ships turned the North Sea and the Baltic from cold edges of the world into busy highways. Silver from the Abbasid Caliphate ended up buried in Swedish fields. Irish slaves were sold in markets on the Seine. Furs from the Arctic reached the silk-robed courtiers of Constantinople. Words, ideas, technologies, and genes moved along those same routes, in every direction. They toppled kings and made new ones, but they also founded towns that outlived them as Vikings. Dublin, York, Novgorod, Reykjavik, trading hubs, legal assemblies, and hybrid communities where Norse, Celtic, Slavic, and Saxon customs collided and fused. Their law codes were copied, their ship designs imitated, their warrior ideals absorbed into knightly culture and royal propaganda. Why did they leave? Because home was crowded, opportunities were limited, and the sea offered possibility. What did they find? A patchwork of fragile powers, rich trade networks, and open frontiers that rewarded risk, cooperation, and ruthless creativity. What went wrong? The game changed. Stronger states, new faiths, shifting climates, and maturing markets closed the window that had once made going Viking a winning strategy. What they left behind isn't a simple tale of heroes or monsters. It's a web of connections, languages peppered with Norse words, place names on modern maps, legal traditions, genetic footprints, and stories still told 1,000 years later. If this changed how you think about the Vikings, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who only knows the horned helmet version. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from, and what surprised you most about the real Viking story?